Alright, so this is the lecture for Chapter 2. Ignore the blanket cape. I forgot my sweater upstairs and don't feel like going to get it. So, this one really goes over various study designs and kind of a base level of statistics. I don't really go into a whole lot on the stats part, just because I know most of you probably haven't taken a stats class yet, and I don't want to swamp you with it. There's a lot of necessity to good research design, because without good research design, there's no good research, which means there's no good psychology. So, first thing I'm going to cover is the two modes of thinking. So the first one is System 1, which is also known as intuitive thinking. My last lecture, I talk a little bit about snap judgments. That's pretty much what System 1 thinking is, whereas System 2 is more in-depth, more analytical, more critical of any incoming information. And System 1's like, oh, there's something vaguely shaped like a threat to me. It is probably a threat. As far as methodology, I'm going to cover 5 different types. There's naturalistic observation, case study designs, self-report measures, correlational studies, and experimental designs. So as far as naturalistic observation is basically watching a behavior in a real-world setting without trying to manipulate the situation. Major advantage, it's high in external validity, but low in internal validity. And if you don't know what those are, it's okay. I'm going to get to that a little bit later in the lecture. So scientists, So this is the type of observation that's typically used in empiricism, which I discussed a little bit last lecture. It's basically like the first stepping stone in scientific research, is you use observation and you build on it to develop a more critical design that can be scientifically tested. So case studies. You don't have to read that whole paragraph on the right. I'll hit the high points. Also, I am going to be providing a sample case study for you guys on Blackboard. It's a published study that is a case study. If you're really interested in how these are written, I highly encourage you to check it out. It's not required reading, but I thought it would be a cool resource for you guys. So basically, case studies tend to focus more on individuals instead of groups. So if you look at the paragraph, it starts with a 53-year-old male with moderate intellectual disability. And then the second paragraph, a 61-year-old male. So they are studying specific people with specific things they're interested in. This is typically done as like, kind of like exploring, like, okay, is this phenomenon real? Like, can we find incidents of this and use that to build on? So the major advantage, it can provide existence proofs, which is basically showing like, hey, this thing actually happened. Look what we found. They also allow us to study rare or unusual phenomenon. So if it's something so rare that you can't really get a group of people to study it in, you would want to do a case study. And it offers insights for later systematic testing. So if you can find enough incidents and enough people, then you could make a case for why you could study this further in more correlational or experimental designs. Now, the major disadvantage is these are typically anecdotal, so we can't really infer causation. It's more just fancy observation, like, well, we saw that this actually does happen, but we can't explain it just yet. We just know that it does happen. So self-report measures, this is one of the most widely debated things in the field of psychology. Like, it is, yeah. So as far as self-report measures, so typically if you're using self-report measures, you want to use random selection to get your participants, which is a procedure that ensures every person in a population has an equal chance of being chosen to participate in your study. Any non-random selection really limits your generalizability. You could also be accused of cherry picking or something of that nature. So it's really best just, when in doubt, use random selection. So as far as how measures are evaluated, the two main things are reliability and validity. Reliability is the consistency of the measure. So if multiple different people use it in multiple different settings, it's going to work the same. Whereas validity is the extent to which it captures what it's actually supposed to capture. So one of the issues with this is there are certain things that are very highly comorbid, like anxiety and depression. So self-report measures for those are not really the best, because it may be tapping into more depression, it may be tapping more into anxiety, and so there's a lot of controversy about that. Another big thing is phrasing. So as I've mentioned before, culture is a huge factor. It influences a lot of different things in research, as does language. There can be language barriers, cultural barriers, regional differences in a specific language, to where one phrase in one situation can mean something entirely different in a different situation. And for anyone who's seen Archer, yeah, some people don't do phrasing anymore, but you're supposed to. And this is why you don't want to leave a whole lot of room for interpretation more often than not. Some instances definitely call for room for interpretation. And in those instances, it is totally acceptable. It's just, more often than not, you want it to be as straightforward as you can, just to kind of eliminate some of these possible ambiguities. So the major advantage of self-report measures is for measures of personality traits and behaviors, they work pretty well. But the major disadvantages are possible lack of insight, meaning people may not be in tune enough with their beliefs or their personality or their behaviors to accurately report these things. Another one is the jumbo can of worms known as social desirability bias. Basically, that is when people shift behaviors or responses to questions in order to avoid negative evaluations or opinions. This happens especially when you're evaluating negative behaviors like addiction or negative belief systems like prejudice and discrimination. Like, you can't just outwardly ask someone, are you racist? Because almost always they will deny it with a passion. No, I'm not racist. Even if they hold racist ideas, even if they do racist behaviors, they will deny it adamantly. So you have to go about it a little bit more subtly in order to get an accurate representation in your data. The opposite of this is malingering, which is portraying yourself in a negative way. So as if you have a psychological disorder, or that you're not competent enough to stand trial in a court of law, things like that. So the big debate is self-report versus rating data. So self-report is where someone reports things about themselves. Rating data is where you find people who know this person and you have them provide evaluations of them, which has the exact same disadvantages as self-report measures, with the added pain of trying to track people down that know your participant. So either way, it's not great, it's not ideal, but we gotta take what we can get at this point. So correlational studies are super common in a lot of quantitative research. So I provided you guys a correlation table from a paper I'm currently working on. Most correlation tables and correlation matrices will have a very similar format, if not an identical format. And you guys don't really have to pay too much attention to that. It's really just to give you guys like an introduction to some of the stats you will experience throughout the psychology program, and just kind of give you a little bit of background and foundation. So if you notice how some of them have asterisks and some of them don't, the ones with asterisks have what is called statistical significance. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, I will get to it later in the lecture. But basically it means there is at least a 95% chance that those findings were not due to random chance alone, and that there is a very high likelihood there is a relationship between those two variables. So, identifying correlational studies. So some studies are exclusively correlational. You don't really see that a whole lot anymore, but if you go into older research before we knew as much as we know now, you'll see it a lot. A lot of studies will still use correlation today, though, just to demonstrate, yes, there's a relationship between these two variables that we want to examine, and we want to probe it further. It's really just showing background and kind of reason for why they want to examine the relationship between these two variables. So correlations can be either positive, negative, or zero. So positive means when one variable increases or decreases, the other variable does the same. So for example, right here, as one increases, the other increases. A negative relationship is pretty much the exact opposite. As one variable increases, the other decreases. And no relationship or zero correlation means there's not really a relationship there. So a perfect positive correlation would be 1.0. A perfect negative correlation would be negative 1.0. And then an absolute zero correlation would be, you guessed it, 0. And again, you guys don't have to worry too much about the specifics on that. I'm really just trying to do my best to kind of give y'all some background and a little bit of foundation. So these pretty pictures right here are what are called scatter plots, which is typically the first step in establishing a relationship between two variables. So you do a scatter plot, and then you do a correlation analysis, and then you can move on to more advanced statistics from there. So one issue with correlations is illusory correlations. I don't know if I said that right, I'm fine with it. But basically that means two variables are perceived to be related when they're actually not. So like I mentioned in my last video, murder and ice cream rates. Both of them are related to heat, but murder and ice cream are not related. So they would yield something very similar to the no relationship or a very weak relationship since they are related to the same variable. So as far as experimental designs go, an experiment is a research design characterized by random assignment of participants to conditions and manipulation of an independent variable, commonly abbreviated as IV. I will be using the same abbreviation throughout the lecture. So random assignment is where an experimenter randomly sorts participants into groups, typically one experimental group and one control group. Sometimes there are multiple experimental groups, which I will talk about when we get to the placebo effect. So experimental group is the group of participants that receives the manipulation. The control group is the group of participants that does not receive the manipulation. You need the control group because otherwise there's really no way of showing that what you're trying to establish is any better than not doing anything at all. So again, independent variable, IV, variables that experimenter manipulates. A DV or dependent variable, also commonly called an outcome variable, are variables or variables that an experimenter measures to see whether the manipulation produces an effect. This is why you want a control group, because if you just manipulate one thing and you get an effect, there's no way of knowing if that actually happened or if that would happen even if you didn't manipulate anything. And then we have operational definitions, which are the working definition of what a researcher is measuring. So for example, if a researcher wants to study anxiety, they can't just say anxiety, because there are tons and tons and tons of different ways of measuring it. And if you just say anxiety, if someone tries to replicate your findings, they're probably going to struggle with it just because there are so many different ways of approaching that. So for example, a researcher might say, we will be measuring anxiety with scale A, and we will be using that as the operational definition of anxiety. And so that gives you a little bit better idea, and that definitely helps with the replication process. As far as confounds are basically a third-party variable that can potentially influence the relationship between your independent variable and your dependent variable that is not part of your manipulation. So if anything influences that relationship that was not directly manipulated by the experimenter, that can severely alter results and may render the findings null, unfortunately. So it's always best to try and rule out other explanations or third-party variables and stuff like that, just to really solidify your claim that yes, changing this one thing produces a change in your dependent variable. So as far as pitfalls, the big one is the placebo effect, which is the improvement resulting from the mere expectation of improvement. So, for example, your control group, if you're testing medication or therapy, you can't just not provide them something, so you will provide them a placebo instead. And if you have one group that is receiving the placebo, and then another that is receiving the actual treatment, and both have similar results, your treatment may actually just be the product of a placebo effect, whereas if you have one group on placebo and one with the actual treatment, and your treatment group improves drastically more than your placebo group, then there is a high chance that your treatment is actually doing something. And then the opposite of the placebo is the nocebo, which is harm resulting from the expectation of harm. One example that I can think of is if you say how you're gonna like do an obedience study or something. Well, not nowadays, you can't do that nowadays, but like older psychologists, when they were doing learning and obedience studies, sometimes they would get nocebo effects just because the participants would expect harm, and so that would affect the results. And then there's the experiment expectancy effect, which is the phenomenon in which researchers' hypotheses lead them to unintentionally bias the outcome of a study, which does unfortunately happen. It's their pet theory, it's their hypothesis, they want it to be true, and so they may unintentionally sway things so that it is true, or it is supported, or there is evidence for it. And this is where blinds come in. So a single blind study is where the participants do not know which group they're in. And a double blind study, which is used more often than not to help prevent against this, is where neither the participants nor the experimenter know what group the participants are in. There will typically be a middleman administering the test and collecting results, and then just giving the data to the professor or the experimenter. And then there are demand characteristics, which are cues that participants pick up on from a study that allow them to generate guesses regarding the researcher's hypothesis. So these are kind of hard to protect against. Again, best bet is just double blind, but fortunately, if you're trying to do a study or an experiment, and there are people who are savvy in the ways of studies and experiments, they might pick up on this, and unfortunately, it can happen, and to the best of my knowledge, there's not really any safeguards against it. I could be wrong. Again, that's just the extent of my knowledge. So ethical issues. There are a lot of, unfortunately, infamous studies that contain ethical violations. So for the Little Albert, the Monster Study, the Milgram Obedience Study, and the Bystander Effect Study, I am providing a video from SciShow because I felt like they go into great detail and they explain it very well. I will be chiming in occasionally just to provide additional information that they didn't include. But yeah, here you go.
Studying the human mind is a tricky business. There's still so much we don't know, and so many questions scientists are looking to answer. But when researchers are working with human subjects, they have to balance getting answers with protecting their subjects. In the past, they haven't always been good about taking care of the fellow human beings they're studying. A lot of historical psychology experiments would be considered unethical by today's standards, and the foundation of the ethical standards we use today comes from the 1970s, when scientists came up with a list of rules to protect the security and privacy of human volunteers. It's known as the Belmont Report. Basically, 3 key ethical principles to guide all human research. The first point is called respect for persons, and it means that subjects have to give informed consent. Anyone who participates in human research, including psychological research, needs to know the risks and benefits of the experiment before signing up. The second ethical principle is called beneficence, and it basically means that researchers should try not to have any negative impact on the well-being of the people who participate in their studies. Basically, do no harm. The final point, justice, involves making sure that subjects aren't exploited. Researchers should also make sure that the burdens of the study and the benefits of the results are distributed fairly. In early research studies, for example, the subjects would often be poor, while wealthier patients would benefit from the results of the experiment. And that's not okay. These rules apply to human research in all fields, including psychology. But the code of conduct hasn't always been so clearly defined, and before it was, there were a lot of questionable studies being done. In the year 1920, a psychologist named John Watson wanted to show that humans can be classically conditioned, like what happened to Pavlov's dogs. Basically, classical conditioning means pairing a stimulus, like food, that triggers a physical response, like drooling, with an unrelated stimulus, like a bell. Even though ringing a bell, of course, wouldn't normally make dogs drool, when Pavlov paired the sound with food, he conditioned the dogs to respond to the bell by drooling. Watson and his team decided to prove that this could be done in humans by classically conditioning a 9-month-old baby named Albert using animals and scary noises. First, the researchers presented Albert with a fuzzy white rat. As he'd reach out to pet the animal, the psychologists would strike a hammer against a metal bar behind his head, creating a loud noise to startle him. Eventually, just the sight of the white rat was enough to make Albert start crying and crawl away. He'd begun to associate the fear of the loud, scary noise with the fuzzy white rat. So yeah, Albert had been conditioned. But this study failed in a lot of ways. For one thing, it used a single subject and no controls, so Watson hadn't really proved anything. But then, of course, there were the ethical issues. Watson never reconditioned Albert to not be afraid anymore, so he was permanently affected by the experiment and not in a good way. We also don't know if Albert's mother fully consented to the research, which definitely violates the main ethical principles of the Belmont Report. And this wasn't the only horrifying psychology experiment conducted on children in the early 20th century. In the late 1930s, a psychologist named Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa wanted to know how positive and negative feedback affected the way children learned language. They decided to test this directly by giving kids positive and negative feedback on speech disorders. That might not sound so bad, but there's a reason why their experiment is now known as the Monster Study. Tudor recruited 22 children from an orphanage, told them they'd be given speech therapy, and split them into 2 groups. 10 of these children, 5 in each group, had early signs of stutters. But both groups also included kids with normal speech patterns. The kids in one group were told that they didn't have a stutter. They were given positive feedback, that they'd outgrow the speech difficulties, and that they should ignore anyone who criticized the way they spoke. Meanwhile, those in the other group were told that they did have a stutter, and that they should never speak unless they could do it right. As you can probably imagine, this didn't go very well. The encouragement and criticism didn't seem to have much of an effect on the children's stutters, but the different kinds of feedback did have a huge impact on their self-esteem. The kids with speech issues who got positive feedback didn't lose their stutters, but they did become a lot more confident when they spoke. Meanwhile, the children who were given negative feedback became more withdrawn, self-conscious, and frustrated, whether or not they actually had a stutter to begin with. So for that group of kids, this research was pretty damaging. As minors, they couldn't consent to the research, and the people who ran the orphanage didn't protect them from the potential harm of the study. The children also weren't debriefed after the project was over, and there was no real follow-up on how they may have been affected by the study long term. All of these things were later declared unethical by the Belmont Report. Experiments.
So, a few things here. So, it directly contradicts the beneficence portion of the Belmont Report, which translates into the beneficence and non-maleficence portion of the APA Code of Ethics. So, if this was conducted today, they would be crucified by the APA Ethics Board. Like, pretty much any of these studies mentioned here in the ethical violations portion, if they tried to conduct that today, it would be no bueno. It would not fly. It would not even make it to the actual experiment portion. This also violates the informed consent. They didn't properly tell these kids what they were going to be doing. They didn't debrief them, which is a huge issue that'll be going a little bit more in depth later in the lecture, but definitely keep that in mind.
Of course, can harm adult subjects too. In 1961, a researcher at Yale University named Stanley Milgram was interested in the psychology of obedience. He decided to see how subjects would react when a researcher pushed them to do things that went against their morals. The study he came up with is now called the Milgram experiment, and it had 3 separate roles. The experiment.
So, just a quick little background piece on this. So Milgram was actually interested in obedience following World War II, where a lot of German soldiers claimed they were merely following orders, and he wanted to see to what extent people would blindly follow orders, especially if they believed they would not be held responsible for the outcomes. Additionally, there's a pretty good movie about this. It's just called Milgram. Not entirely accurate, but it is an interesting watch if you enjoy psychological history.
Mentor, played by a scientist in a white lab coat, was the authority figure. The teacher was the role assigned to the experimental subject, and the final role was the learner, a paid actor who the subject thought was actually another volunteer. The learner was sent to a separate room so they were out of sight while the experimenter observed the teacher, the subject, instructing the learner in a word pairing task over an intercom. Every time the learner got the word pair wrong, the teacher pressed a button to shock them, with the voltage increasing by 15 volts for every wrong answer. The subject believed they were shocking the learner, but they were actually listening to an actor pretending to be in pain, complaining of chest pains, shouting, pounding on the wall, and eventually going silent. The experiment only ended when the teacher had given the maximum 450 volt shock 3 times in a row, or when they refused to continue. 65% of the subjects did give out those maximum voltage shocks, just because a scientist in a white lab coat told them to. Milgram concluded that people will obey authority figures even in morally questionable circumstances, and the experiment has since led to many more studies on the psychology of authority. But the subjects thought they were actually listening to someone being electrocuted on the other end of the line, even though they were told by the experimenter that there would be, quote, no permanent tissue damage. Leaving your subjects feeling like they may have just killed someone doesn't protect their well-being, and they couldn't have gotten informed consent, since warning participants about the experiment would have changed how they reacted. And since then, there have indeed been other studies that led people to believe they might be hearing someone get seriously injured. In 1964, a woman
So while informed consent was an issue, there was also a lack of debriefing. So these participants probably went on, throughout possibly the rest of their lives thinking, oh my God, I killed someone. And that is not okay. That is undue psychological distress put upon these participants by the experimenter, and that is a direct ethical violation.
A woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered. At the time, newspapers reported that there were more than 30 witnesses to the murder and that none of them called the police. We now know that those reports were flawed, but for a while it seemed like dozens of people just stood by while someone was murdered right in front of them. So in 1968, psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané at Columbia University came up with a way to learn more about why people might not act in a crisis, especially if there are others around. They placed college student volunteers alone in rooms, gave them headphones, and told them that the study was about the emotional issues faced by students. Each subject was told that they would be communicating with a few other students over intercom to avoid any privacy issues that might come up if they were face-to-face. But the other students on the line were actually recordings, and one of those recorded students mentioned early on in the conversation that they had occasional seizures. Later on in the experiment, that voice would start to have trouble speaking and ask for help, saying they were having a seizure. The researchers then measured how long it took the subjects to go look for help. They found that it took participants longer to respond when there were more people in the conversation. The subject was less likely to do something if they believed there were other people who could intervene instead. It's called the bystander effect. Understanding this response is important for investigating crimes and for protecting communities by teaching people to act during a crisis instead of assuming that someone else will do it. But like the Milgram experiment, there are ethical concerns about how this research might have affected the subjects after the study was over. These days, it would be tough to convince a review board that the potential benefits of this kind of study outweigh the risks. Another study turned out to be so damaging that it had...
So, I am going to go ahead and move to the next study, just because they only briefly talk about the Stanford Prison Experiment, and I feel like that one needs a whole video in and of itself, because y'all will see. It is rough. I will let y'all know now. Proceed with caution to the next slide. And, if you have to skip past it, you have to skip past it, because it gets a little rough. So this is a trigger warning. Just, full disclosure, they talk about what's essentially abuse in the name of psychological research. So just, again, proceed with caution. So...
In August of 1971, Professor Philip Zimbardo began an investigation into the power dynamics that exist between guards and inmates in a prison setting. The object of the Stanford Prison Experiment was to determine if it was the acquisition of power that made guards turn brutal, or whether brutality was actually intrinsic to human nature itself. The notorious experiment that ensued would kick off decades of academic controversy and suggest some very dark things about the nature of humanity. Today, we're going to take a look at why the Stanford Prison Experiment might be the most disturbing study ever conducted. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other psychology-related topics you would like to hear about.
So I do want to interject here. They say how it might be the worst one ever done. Gotta disagree with that. I will discuss that a little bit further when we get into the origin of ethics codes, but maybe the worst one done in America. I'll just leave y'all with that for now.
During the 1970s, both the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were interested in learning about the hierarchies of power in military prisons. Accordingly, the U.S. Office of Naval Research issued Philip Zimbardo a grant to study the relationships between prison guards and prisoners. The objective would be to determine if those relationships were shaped more by the prison environment or the personalities of the guards. The grant would be used to create a mock prison environment in which to conduct the experiment and to pay the participants. The Stanford Prison Experiment started with an ad Zimbardo placed in the classifieds. It read, "Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life, $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. 70 people applied."
So the reason it said male students is because back then female students were a rarity and were highly underrepresented in college campuses. So yes, they used male students simply because female students weren't really examined as much in those days of psychology, which is messed up, I know, but unfortunately it's just a fact of the time.
The applicants were interviewed and asked to take personality tests. Anyone who had a criminal record or record of abusing narcotics was eliminated, as was anyone who displayed personality disorders, physical disabilities, or psychological problems. Ultimately, 24 college students, all white and all male, were selected to participate. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. Zimbardo and his team randomly divided the students into 2 groups, prisoners and guards. There were 12 of each category, 9 that were active participants and 3 that were alternates. On August 17, 1971, the experiment began when the 9 prisoners were arrested by actual police officers from the Palo Alto Police Department. Each person was taken into custody, then had their mugshots taken before being fingerprinted, blindfolded, and moved into a holding cell. Finally, they were taken into a mock prison that had been set up in the basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall. The fake prison felt very real. The researchers who created it had consulted with prison officials and ex-convicts before designing it. The cells were built in a space that was normally used as a laboratory. Each cell had a barred door, a cell number, and room for 3 prisoners. Other touches included a solitary confinement cell that had been created in a closet, and a rule that prisoners had to be blindfolded before being taken to the bathroom. To avoid selection bias, participants were assigned to be either prisoners or guards based on the results of a coin toss. Very different fates awaited each respective group. Guards were given real prison guard uniforms, complete with nightsticks and whistles. Many guards even donned mirrored sunglasses, which were meant to prevent eye contact with the prisoners, or maybe just to look like Boss Godfrey from Cool Hand Luke. Prisoners, on the other hand, were stripped, deloused, and dressed in sandals and an ill-fitting numbered smock. They weren't issued any underwear, but they were given nylon stocking caps, which they were asked to wear in lieu of having their heads shaved. Once dressed, a chain was placed on each of their legs. Prisoners were only addressed by their number and had to refer to themselves and the other prisoners in the same way. It was a recipe for dehumanization and oppression. Zimbardo himself served as superintendent of the prison, and researcher David Jaffe played the warden. The 2 were responsible for instructing the guards and laying down the scope of their duties. First and foremost, the guards were told to maintain order. To this end, they were allowed to use any means necessary, short of physical violence. Things that were permitted included harassment, the withholding of food, and the deprivation of privileges at the guard's discretion. The guards, unlike the prisoners, were also allowed to work in shifts. The shifts, which each required 3 guards, lasted 8 hours. Off-duty guards didn't have to be at the prison, but were asked to remain on call in case of an emergency. On the first night, the guards decided to use a whistle to rouse the prisoners from their sleep for a head count at 2:30 a.m. Some of the prisoners didn't take the head count seriously, and the guards punished them by making them do push-ups. After head count, the prisoners had already had enough and decided to rebel. On what was only the second morning of the experiment, they removed the numbers from their uniforms, pulled off their stocking caps, and barricaded themselves inside their cells using their beds. When the next shift of guards arrived in the morning, they were alarmed to find the prisoners yelling curses at them from their cells. They requested reinforcements and made plans to quell the uprising. They brought in the on-call guards, and the night shift volunteered to do extra duty. It was only day 2, and things were already getting ugly. In order to get the cell doors open, the guards used fire extinguishers to force the prisoners away from the barricades. Once that was accomplished...
So one issue with that is if you actually spray someone with a fire extinguisher, it can not only damage their mouth, nose, and airway, it can also damage their lungs just from inhalation of the chemicals in fire extinguishers. Also, yes, that was Ezra Miller. There is another movie about this experiment called the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's sort of accurate, but they did take a lot of theatric liberties with it, but still an interesting watch if you enjoy that sort of thing, or if you want to learn more about it.
They rushed into the cell, grabbed the prisoner, and stripped them naked as a jaybird. The birthday suit prisoner was then placed into solitary confinement. While they were there, the guards would remove the bed from their cell, meaning the prisoner would have to sleep on the floor when they returned. Once the rebellion was controlled, the guards had to figure out how to prevent another from happening without having to have all 9 guards perpetually on duty. The solution was to divide and conquer. The guards deemed one of the cells the privileged cell. Well-behaved prisoners were placed in the privileged cell, where they would get their uniforms and beds back, and even get special meals. The other prisoners were not only denied of all these things, but were deprived of their normal food rations. After a few hours, the guards would randomly move the prisoners around. The idea was to create confusion and sow the seeds of distrust among the inmates. And it worked. In the wake of the uprising, conditions deteriorated fast. The guards started making a point of dehumanizing the prisoners by making them call out their identification numbers. Prisoners were also forbidden from using the bathroom at night and were forced to use a bucket in their cell instead. Soon the guards stopped emptying the buckets, reasoning that the bad smell was simply another punishment for misbehavior. Despite what Zimbardo described as frequent reminders from the staff, the guards grew increasingly aggressive. The most egregious behavior occurred when the staff wasn't paying attention, which became stressful and frustrating for the prisoners. The prisoners, as a result, became increasingly submissive, and the experiment was about to claim its first victim. After only 36 hours, prisoner Doug Corpy began suffering from what was described as acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. The guards used this opportunity to try and coax him into becoming a snitch. But when his erratic behavior continued, the staff realized Doug was in genuine distress and needed to be released from the experiment. On the 6th day, Zimbardo convened a mock parole board, which was headed by one of the experiment's prison consultants. Inmates who believed they deserved parole would be allowed to present their case to the board. It was during these presentations that Zimbardo, along with the other researchers, began to theorize that the prisoners no longer saw themselves as participants in an experiment, but as real prisoners. According to Zimbardo, the prisoners had internalized their crimes, as well as their roles as inmates. As for the guards, he came to identify 3 different types. Tough but fair guards, who followed prison rules. Good guys, who did little favors for the prisoners and never punished them. And finally, guards who appeared to thoroughly enjoy the power they wielded. Zimbardo felt this last group was hostile, arbitrary, and inventive in their forms of prisoner humiliation. Zimbardo concluded that most people were ultimately willing to fulfill whatever role they were given in a respective social setting.
So I do want to comment on that. So basically what they just described is sociopathic and psychopathic tendencies. which were clearly not present at the beginning of the study because everyone passed a mental health evaluation. So just something to keep in mind.
He even admitted that he had internalized his role as superintendent over his role as a psychologist. At one point, Zimbardo brought in a real priest to talk with the prisoners. It was during this conversation that prisoner 819 broke down sobbing. He was so hysterical that the staff agreed to take him to a doctor. The other inmates, for their part, turned on 819. Researchers offered to send him home, but 819 surprisingly refused, saying that he couldn't leave because the other inmates had labeled him a bad prisoner. Zimbardo was forced to intervene. Pulling the student aside, he forcefully reminded him that he was not really an inmate and that the experiment was not really a prison. The prisoner is alleged to have stopped crying and looked at Zimbardo like a small child awakened from a nightmare. After that, 819 agreed to leave. On the sixth day, a recent PhD recipient named Christina Maslach was brought in to interview the prisoners. Horrified by what she saw, she confronted Zimbardo, asking him how he could see what she had seen and not care about the students who were suffering. According to Zimbardo, he quickly realized she was right. It was at that moment that he decided to prematurely end the study. Later, he would reflect on his own behavior and claim that it wasn't until his discussion with Maslach that he realized how deeply he had internalized his role at the prison. Ultimately, he concluded he was thinking like a prison superintendent rather than a research psychologist. Both the ethics and conclusions of the Stanford prison experiment remain highly controversial. Its scientific rigor has been repeatedly questioned by scientists who have been unable to duplicate its results. And even Zimbardo himself has admitted the whole thing was more of a demonstration than a scientific experiment. A 2018 book by French academic Thibault Letexier dismissed the entire thing as nonsense. He argued that the guards had been told what results they were supposed to produce and were advised and guided by Zimbardo and his staff the whole way through. So what do you think? How would you have...
So, even if the whole study doesn't have any scientific rigor, the reason why it's such an ethical violation is for the amount of harm it did to the participants, especially those that were prisoners. Like, it's impossible not to argue that this produced lasting psychological effects, negative psychological effects on these participants, and that is not okay, not at all. It shouldn't have been okay then, and it definitely is not okay now, because not only do they violate the beneficence clause, but the way they treated those kids, or those young adults, also violates the respect for persons. Like, you can't claim to respect someone and treat them so terribly. That is not okay at all. So the history behind a lot of our ethics codes is a long and brutal history, unfortunately. So where it actually originated was from the Nuremberg trials. For any of you unaware, that is the trial of German soldiers for war crimes following the Holocaust. And some of these war crimes were for heinous experiments conducted on unwilling participants in concentration camps. One of the most brutal and disturbing ones is the twin studies. It's too graphic for me to cover here. If you're interested, I encourage you to do outside research. If you don't have the stomach for it, that is totally okay. Details will not be on the quiz or the test because I do not want to cover them here. Like, yeah, no, just if you're really interested, look into it. But if you're not, that is totally okay as well. It's just to give you a heads up, like, there's information on it out there, but definitely proceed with caution, especially if you're easily triggered or have a weak stomach, because it's really bad. So following the Nuremberg trials, the Belmont Report was established, which was covered by SciShow briefly, and their explanation of a few infamous ethical violations. It is a direct result of the Nuremberg trials. They saw all of these horrible things happening. They saw what Milgram did. They saw what a lot of the early psychologists did before the Belmont Report was released. And they're like, yeah, no, we can't let this keep happening. We need to put in some safeguards to prevent this from happening in the future. It has 3 pillars. Respect for persons, so respect people's autonomy. You have to give them informed consent. You can't force them to participate. If they want to leave in the middle of the study, they have every right to do so, and you cannot stop them. Beneficence, so minimize harm and maximize benefits. And justice is distribute the research burdens and benefits evenly. So you can't give like all the benefits to one group of people based on race, age, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, like anything like that. You can't do it. Everyone needs an equal opportunity to benefit from your study, especially the participants that are in your study. So the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, developed their code of ethics based on the Belmont Report, and they just expanded it a little bit. They also based it on, of course, the famous ethical violations, well, infamous ethical violations. So the first one is beneficence and non-maleficence, which is help people and do no harm. The next one is fidelity and responsibility. So establish relationships of trust and don't make the field of psychology look bad. So basically, don't lie to people about what you found. No, nope, not okay. Not okay, not okay, not okay. I cannot emphasize that enough. If you conduct fraudulent research and it gets out, you will be crucified by both the psychological and the overall scientific community. It won't fly. Don't do it. Don't, no. Next, very related to fidelity and responsibility is integrity. Promote accuracy, honesty, and trustfulness in science, teaching, and practice. Again, don't lie to the people. Don't do it. Next is justice. Again, all people are entitled to benefit from psychological research. So if you purposely target one group of people to benefit from your research, that's not okay. That is a huge ethical violation. It is not okay. Don't do it. Next is respect for people's rights and dignity. You have to respect their right to privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination, meaning you got to provide informed consent. You have to protect their information, meaning you can't just give out their information willy-nilly. They are trusting you with that. You can't do it. There are actually specific practices you have to follow when you're conducting scientific research to protect the identity and the personal information of your participants, because if you don't have those safeguards in place, your study will not get approved, period. Will not happen. You got to provide those protections, because if you don't, you are violating that principle. That is not okay. So the Institutional Review Board, commonly known as the IRB, some of you may have heard this term thrown around a little bit, but basically they're the watchdogs of research on humans. It's a committee that has to approve your research idea and methodology, meaning you have to provide them with the informed consent form you intend to have participants sign. You have to tell them what steps you will be taking to protect the confidentiality of the participants in your study before you can even conduct your research. Because if they don't approve or they find flaws in it, ain't gonna happen. Ain't gonna happen. Their core purpose is to prevent future ethical violations and protect both you and your participants. If any harm falls upon your participants, it is directly your fault, and you will be held responsible entirely. So even if you try to say, oh, well, my institution said this was okay, doesn't matter. You are the researcher. It is your responsibility to make sure these safeguards are in place. And if they are not, that is your fault, buddy. So as far as informed consent, this is the most important part of research. It has to be obtained before a participant can even participate in your study. You have to give them a good idea of what they are signing up for, any potential risk, any potential benefits, a general idea of what the study is about, and give them the option to opt out. If you don't, it's no bueno. Informed consent is basically informing participants of what's involved in a study before asking them to participate. If they're not well informed, then they cannot make a well-informed decision. And if they're not well informed, they cannot provide informed consent. So it is basically a contract between the participants and the researcher. Participants agree to participate in your study and give you their data and their information, and you agree to protect their information and make sure no harm befalls them while they are participating in your study. So a touchier issue about this is the use of deception. So if it's mild deception that will not cause them harm or anything of the sort, so for example, if you're studying prejudice and discrimination and you tell them, oh, we're studying your attitudes towards other people. Yes, that's deception, but it's justifiable deception because you cannot tell them you're measuring prejudice and discrimination and expect accurate data. However, whenever you use any sort of deception at all, you have to inform them of this deception at the end of the study. So once their data is collected, you have to tell them, hey, I kind of lied a little. And you have to tell them the full intent of the study, what the true purpose of the study is, and what you intend to find from said study. If they want to withdraw their data, they have every right to do so, because that is guaranteed to them through the Code of Ethics, through respect for people, and their self-determination. If they decide they don't want their data included, then you can't include their data, period. You can't do it. You have to respect their self-determination and remove their data from your data set. So this is a touchy subject. So for animal research, if you have all the proper safeguards in place, animal subjects can be used for research that human participants cannot. So as far as animal rights, there have been a lot of groups that went on the super offensive against animal research facilities, but thanks to them, a lot of unnecessary animal research has been brought to a stop. If it can be done on people, it is done on people. If it can't be done on people, there has to be a very, very good reason why they have to use animals. And if that reason is not viewed as justified by the IRB or the IACUC, which is the animal version of the IRB, it really is. It's the exact same. They just focus on animals instead of people. Then you can't do it. You can't use animals. Also, it is your 100% responsibility to obtain these animals ethically and to care for them properly, because if you don't, it's no bueno. The IACUC's going to come after you. Ain't gonna be good. So typically animals are used in learning experiments, so classical conditioning, things of the sort. I actually saw a recent study about how they taught rats to drive these little tiny cars, and it is the cutest thing. I highly recommend y'all check it out. It is adorable. It is a great daily dose of serotonin. It is just, love it. It is so cute. Alright, so descriptive statistics. My notes are all out of order. Y'all bear with me. There we go. Alright, so this is where I go into a little bit of the statistics. Again, I'm going to try to just do surface level stuff, give y'all a basic foundation for these concepts and these terms. So descriptive stats are characterizations that describe the data. So basically just group level stuff, what's the average, where do most people tend to cluster up. And so I'm not sure if many of you have heard of this term, but there's this thing called normal distributions in statistics. And basically it is assumed when you're conducting or when you're analyzing statistics, your data will be normally distributed, which means your data will fall along a neat little bell curve, similar to this one, which means most of the people are going to be right up here, right at the top of the hump. That's where your average is. You'll have a few outliers over here on the low end, a few over here on the high end, but typically those even each other out. So descriptive stats, there are two different ways to approach this. There's measures of central tendency and measures of variability. So measures of central tendency are going to be the mean, the median, and the mode. So the mean is just the average. Just add them all up, divide by however many people you collected data from, that is your mean. Your median is the number in the middle of your data set. Your mode is your most common number in the data set. So in a normal distribution, all three of these should be the same. However, if the data is skewed, which means it is not a normal distribution, which can cause a variety of statistical issues, which I'm not going to get into. That's for your later professors. But basically, this is what a negative skew looks like. And if you see, the mean, the median, and the mode are all different. Same over here on the positive skew, which indicates that the data is not normally distributed. Because if your mode is higher than your mean, then you've got a skew. Same thing with if your median is higher than your mean or lower than your mode, you've got a skew. So again, this can cause a variety of statistical problems when you're conducting analyses, but again, I'm not going to get super into it. If you guys have questions about that, feel free to come to my office hours. I will answer them to the best of my ability. So as far as a negative skew, if you notice the hump is on the right side and the tail is on the left side, and the opposite is true for the positive skew. And no, the direction of skewness does not matter. They will both equally mess with your data, and neither one is preferred over the other because they're both a colossal pain to deal with when you're getting into your analyses. As far as variability, so measures of variability measure how loosely or tightly bunched together your scores are. So think of it in terms of like darts on a dartboard. If they're all really close to the bullseye, then you have low variability. If they are all off the dartboard, then you have very high variability. And an extreme in either direction is not good. If the variability is too low, it can lead to what's known as restriction of range, which limits your generalizability, which means your findings really don't apply to a whole lot of people, and that's an issue. If the variability is too high, then there's a chance that there may not be a relationship there that could lead to a null hypothesis or non-significant findings. So either extreme is bad, so you want just somewhere in the middle. As far as range, so range is the difference between the highest and the lowest score. So again, you don't want this to be too big, but you don't want it to be too small either. And your standard deviation takes into account how far each data point is from the next. So if your standard deviation is really low in a really big sample, that means you have very low variability. But if it's really high in a really small sample, that means you have too much variability. So if you have a small sample, you want them closer together. If you have a very large sample, it can be bigger. But ultimately your goal is shoot somewhere in the middle. As far as inferential statistics, this is the higher up statistics. So this is where you get into correlations and ANOVAs and stuff like that. And again, I know that is probably gibberish to a lot of you right now, and that's okay. You will come across these terms later. For anyone in the psych program, you may come across them next semester. I'm not sure what your course schedule looks like, but you will come across them if you are in the psychology program at UTSA, guaranteed. So statistical significance, I mentioned this in the correlation portion of the lecture, but basically, if a finding is statistically significant, then that means there is at least a 95% chance that the result was not found by random chance. There is probably a relationship between them. However, practical significance, so statistical significance does not mean your finding has any practical applications. Like, you can find a significant relationship between height and intelligence. That doesn't mean it has any practical significance. So last but not least, evaluating psychological research. I talked about this a little bit in the Chapter 1 lecture, but reporters are not trained to properly interpret and report scientific research. So if you hear a reporter or a news anchor talking about a scientific study, always take it with a grain of salt. I highly encourage you to do your own research on the matter because, again, they're not properly trained to do this, and it's no fault of their own. most of them probably don't have a scientific background. They wanted to go into news or something like that. Like, it's no fault of their own, but it is just something to keep in mind. Like, if you hear them reporting on it, do your own research and just check into it and make sure they are accurately reporting the findings. Other than that, I'm going to do my best to have the Chapter 2 quiz up tonight for y'all. And then Chapter 3 should be up sometime later this week, and I apologize for how long it took me to get this one up for y'all. So, just a reminder, office hours, Wednesdays, 3 to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. I know some of you are off campus, and so I try to keep in the Central Standard Time just to prevent any confusion. And again, if y'all have any questions, feel free to come to me. If y'all have any content questions, Kelly Cortez, your SI instructor, has been kind enough to open her email to y'all. And her sessions should be starting this week as well. So again, she is your point of contact for that information. I'm not sure when her sessions will be. She will be able to provide you better information and more accurate information than I can.